welcome everyone. I want you all to know I'm in a loud environment, so if you hear some background noise, please forgive me. But let's see if we can get everything here. Is my screen sharing? All right, there we go. All right, so the title of today's study is going to be Creation's Counterfeit. And just as Stan mentioned, what is the difference between creation, evolution? Where does it come from? And what are the hidden philosophies and meanings behind some of these things that we've been told? So the first thing I want to read is from Second Peter chapter 3, verses 3 through 6. And that says, knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers walking after their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. And then it says, for this they willingly are ignorant of, which basically means they are purposefully not learning. They are basically being dumb on purpose, being ignorant of that by the word of God, the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. So basically, what it's saying that in the last days, there are going to be people who question the creation and the flood accounts. And so by studying this and by understanding this, we will understanding of not only who we are today, but where we come from. And then that could also lead us to answering the question of where we will be going after death. Now, if you ask some people, some atheists or some non-believers, what they say, what is the purpose of life? Quentin Smith says the only reasonable belief is that we came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. Now, I don't know about you all, but that seems like a very definitive statement. And to be honest with you, I'm not 100% sure what this is based on. He's saying that the universe just came to be, that it has no cause, it has no purpose, and the reason we're here is up to anybody's guess or determination. Now, I want to define something something that's really important, and that is the word faith. The Bible defines faith as the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, from Hebrews 11, verse 1. Now, I want to be clear, faith is not necessarily a bad thing. And I think that we all have faith to some extent, whether it's faith in our family or faith in the government or faith in ourselves, whatever the case is. But we have to put it in its proper place. And so throughout the study, I hope to share with you that the things that are going to be contained in here is not simply based on faith, but just on fact alone. Now let's define science, because this is often considered to be the antithesis of faith. The Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines it as knowledge about or study of the natural world based on facts learned through experiments and observation. So in order for it to be considered science, you have to run experiments, and it has to be factual, and it has to be something that you can observe, right? Take it in a laboratory, do your tests, come up with or do a hypothesis. All those things are required for it to be considered scientific. And it makes sense why this would be considered the opposite of faith. Now, again, neither of them are bad things. There's a quote I have here. Let's see, is it sharing? It says, there is no law against daydreaming, but science must not indulge in it. Pierre Paul Grass. And I agree with this statement, right? Science can't just be all about daydreaming. You have to have factual evidence. And even First Timothy chapter 6 says something similar. Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science falsely so called. So here Paul is telling Timothy, do not be taken away by false science, right? So I think the Bible and this individual, Pierre Paul Grass, agree right here. Now, whenever I talk about evolution, most people only know of one type, they maybe macroevolution or something. But whenever I have this discussion with people, I like to define what I'm talking about. That's why I like to start these studies with definitions of things so that we can have a strong foundation. And whenever I get into the conversation of evolution, I want to explain to people that there are actually 6 different types of evolution, and we'll run through them really quickly here. So the first type is cosmic evolution, and that is also considered the Big Bang, the start of the universe. There's stellar evolution, which is the formation of galaxies and stars. Then you have chemical evolution, which is gases turning into solid chemicals. So how do you get hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, all those things? And then you have to have organic evolution. How does cellular matter like granite rock or something turn into cellular matter, which is able to create life? So plants, fruits, uh, creatures, humans, etc. And then you have Darwinian evolution or macroevolution, and that is organisms that change above the species level, right? So that means a giraffe eventually evolving to a zebra, eventually evolving into a feline of some sort, like a cheetah, and down to humans and all that stuff. Evolution or microevolution, and this is variations within a species. Now, we're going to go throughout the study and determine which of these actually exist and which ones we've actually seen, observed. So, but I want to keep this in your mind that these are the definitions of evolution. Now, if we're having this conversation, we also have to bring up creation. So what are some arguments against the existence of creation? The three common arguments I will hear is lack of empirical evidence, difficulty with creation as a concept, having a hard time understanding how can you speak things into existence, etc. And then lack of design or the presence of bad design. So let's go through those. Lack of empirical evidence. Basically, this just means a direct form of knowledge, like touching, seeing, smelling, hearing, etc. And this can be an argument, but I think it's a weak one at best. And the reason why I believe that is because there are so many things that we have touched or smelled or anything like that, and yet we know they exist. For example, my brain, I have never seen it, I've never touched it, I have never smelled it, and yet I believe it exists. I have never seen that that water, when I zoom in, actually is written H2O on it. And so there's a lot of and a lot of scientific formulas fit into this category as well. The fact that the velocity of gravity or the speed of gravity is negative 9.81, I believe it's milliseconds per. So there's some formula there, but some of those things aren't directly you can't see some of these things. So lack of empirical evidence is not a very strong argument for the absence of creation. What about difficulty with creation as a concept? The two problems here is that creation of the universe, it's not something that has been observed, and it's not in conformity to any known law or nature of science around during creation time. But the truth is, it takes faith to believe in both creation and in evolution. As we looked at before, science is based on observation and experiments. You can't recreate the Big Bang or creation. No one was present at either event, and you can't go back in time to see what the world was like. All we have is the things that we are left with in 2021 for us to study. And then if you want to throw out creation and evolution as nonsensical theories, then we have to come up with a law of science that can actually replace both of those options that can lead us to the truth. And as of right now, I do not have any evidence that that is the case, that someone has come up with a new solution. Let's talk about lack of design or bad design. I have this quote here from Subodh Pandit in his book, Come Search With Me, and it says, "Chaos in one area does not change design to anything other than design. If there is both design and randomness in the same structure, it is the design that takes precedence and provides the correct feature of that structure, even if present in small measure." So let's think about it like this. If I have a broken vase, like in my image up here, this does not negate the presence of a potter or someone who created this, right? Even though it's cracked on the side and it's broken in several pieces, you can still see that there is a design. You could take a look at this painting, which I'm an artist by trade, and I would say this is not the most successful painting I've ever seen, but this does not negate the presence of a painter. So when we look at the world and we say, oh, it has bad design, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Just because you don't find something aesthetically pleasing or because things have eroded or changed over the centuries or millennium or whatever you want to call it, that does not negate the presence of a designer. And we can even see this in something as simple as if I show you pictures of these and you look at it and I say no one constructed these these little sculptures here, you would look at me like I was crazy, because it's very evident that rocks don't just do this by themselves. And this is a technique of called rock balancing, which a lot of people do as a fun hobby, and I think it's rather enjoyable to look at. But look at the design in that. Look at how much patience and balance and structure you have to have in order to create these structures, let alone something that's even more complex than a rock, like a car. No one walks down the street, sees a car, and thinks that just came into existence by itself, or the Eiffel Tower. And then let alone the human body, which is far more complex than either of those two. When you think about all the unique things that have to work in order for humans to do what we do, for example, no one to this day can even define what a thought is. Like, can you touch it? Can you pull it out and extract a thought? Can you can you put it in a jar and turn it red? Like, there are these things that we just don't fully understand and grasp, and yet no one would say that these things don't have a unique design. Let's look at this quote from Bill Bryson. He says in his book, "Singularity has no around it." By the way, singularity is what they call the start of the Big Bang. They say that the theory is that there was a singularity, which is something that was like the size of an atom or much, much smaller, and that exploded and that produced life. There is no space for it to occupy, no place for it to be. There is no past for it to emerge from. And so from nothing, our universe begins. In a single blind pulse, the singularity assumes heavenly dimensions, space beyond conception. So what caused it? Some quality or thing. So now we have him saying, from nothing, our universe begins. And then what caused it? Some quality or thing. One of those statements has to be false. They're saying the exact opposite thing. And it sounds closer to circular reasoning, in my opinion. Let's see, what's next here? All right, let's talk about the age of the Earth. Now, if you go with the theory of evolution, the Big Bang, and etc., they'll say that the Earth is roughly 4.55 billion years old, plus or minus about 1%. And this has been studied by multiple scientists and physicists, and this is the number they roughly came to. If you go to the age of the Earth based on the creation from the story of the Bible, you'll probably find someone named James Ussher, and you'll probably find his chronology. And basically what he did is he took all the dates in the Bible and counted them up and came roughly to about the year 4004 BC as the date of creation. So he would say things like, okay, if Abraham was this age and Noah was this age and Lamech was this age, and he counted backwards. And so based on his understanding, based on creation, the world is roughly 6,000 years old. But when you compare it to the theory of evolution, you have 4.55 billion years. So obviously there's a huge discrepancy between the two, and either both are wrong or one is correct, but both of them cannot be correct. So at this point, we have to come up with a decision. Now, I find this interesting. This is a book, Creation's Tiny Mystery by Robert Gentry. This was a book written in the year 1992, and he is a scientist who studied granite and polonium halos. And I'll read you a statement from his from a book supporting this. Granite is said to be the primordial rock of the Earth, formed over geological timescales of multiplied millions of years. And I'll go into what geological timescales are a little bit later. Polonium-218 is a radioisotope without an earlier form or precursor and has a known half-life of 3 minutes. Basically, it's just saying it's a rock that has no it doesn't derive from anything. It is created or formed by itself as it stands. The radiation causes a signature halo in the particles of rock during the decay of the isotope. Any substance then that has captured a halo had to do it in 3 minutes or less. It's sort of like if I have a piece of ice and a bubble forms in it, and I know that it only took 2 hours for that ice to form from the liquid state of water, then I know that bubble had to form within 2 hours. That's basically what it's saying. It has been incontrovertibly demonstrated that granite rocks from around the world contain polonium-218 halos in such quantity as to establish the widespread nature of the phenomenon. The scientific deduction is astounding. Those giant rocks that seem to make up the foundation and framework of the crust of the planet Earth were formed in 3 minutes. The main rock that we stand on, the granite rock, was formed in 3 minutes based on this science. And now some of you may say, well, how do you know that for sure? Well, for one, nobody has ever formed a piece of granite in the laboratory using all of these theories. No one knows how to create it. And then no one has also demonstrated an original fossil that has been embedded in granite rock, suggesting that there was no extended period of time involved in the process. Now, I'm getting this quote from another book called Come Search With Me, which I quoted before. He met with Robert Gentry and he asked him, had anyone challenged him on his theories? Now, this is in 2008 when he's asking, so we're talking 13 years ago. And he said from the years 1992 up until 2008, no one had even tried to challenge him on his theory. And if he was so incorrect, why wouldn't people be so willing to try his hand? Why wouldn't you disprove it? If you're a scientist, your job is to look for the facts and come up with the clear reasoning for certain things. And yet no one has even dared to try challenge this theory. Question: has there ever been life created in a laboratory? Can you create life from nothing? Or is there such thing as spontaneous generation? When I was in school, when I was in the 9th grade, we learned about this scientist named Francesco Redi. He's an Italian physician from the 1600s, and he created an experiment that was basically designed to determine whether or not life could form by itself. And so he stuck a piece of meat in a jar, and he let the air in just to see what would happen. And over a couple of days, he found that maggots had formed in the meat. But he didn't realize that while he wasn't looking, flies were coming in and laying eggs. And so that completely canceled out his theory. So then he did this project, the experiment again, and he took another flask where he capped it. He put a cork in it so it wouldn't get access to any oxygen. And then another one where it did have access to oxygen, but he put gauze on it. And that one actually attracted flies, but they couldn't get to the meat, basically showing that life cannot form by itself. You cannot create life without any sort of existing life there. Now we have another scientist. This one is German biologist Ernst Haeckel, and he is very famous or infamous for faking his own experiment. Basically, I'll just read it here. As we discover in Haeckel's embryos, German biologist Ernst Haeckel included illustrations of the embryological stages of vertebrates in a series of books published between 1868 and 1908. Fudging the data, he placed the drawings into a comparative grid, highlighting similarities between species and blurring differences. The results are highly inaccurate. So basically, he did this experiment and just to prove where these certain embryos come from and to prove that we had a common ancestor, and he faked all of the drawings. And they published it, and what was really crazy, if we look in the second paragraph here, it says this amorphism disproved, but the use of Haeckel's drawings persisted, particularly in education. There were waves of criticism from the 1870s when the drawings were published up to 1997 as Haeckel's fraud was rediscovered and exploited by creationists. So this was disproved in the late 1800s, and yet it was in the school textbooks for 100 years, basically promoting this false science. And we knew it was wrong. And yet his drawings still persisted, and we're still in these textbooks teaching generations of young students that this is how life starts. And it's completely inaccurate. Ernst Haeckel claimed also that spontaneous generation must be true, not because it had been proven in the laboratory, but because otherwise it would be necessary to believe in a creator. See, here's the real thing about evolution. It's not so much about science, it's actually more about your stance on whether or not a creator exists. And the scary thing for some people, and we'll see some quotes later, if you believe in a creator, then that leads to the conclusion, does he care about my lifestyle, or she care about my lifestyle? Is there something that I'm doing that will be displeasing and to him? And what's next for me? There's so many questions that come from this whole philosophy. Now, this is again back in the late 1800s. We looked at experiments from a few hundred years ago, but now we have modern science, right? So let's see if modern scientists have been able to create life or anything close to it. I have a quote here. It says, "It is fascinating how much effort went into this procedure, creating life from scratch, which really did not create new life. Rather, it simply modified existing molecular machinery that is required for life." And this is sometime written sometime after 2010. So in the last 10 years, they said that we could not create new life. And this is after $40 million and 10 years spent doing the research. Gerald Joyce insists he and Lincoln have not created that door, but of course, we haven't achieved that. Now, here's the interesting thing. If we think about the modern science, how much technology we have, how many resources we have, I feel like we should be able to create life, because let's look at this article. And sorry about the phone ringing. Life as we know it, nearly created in a lab. It says one of life's greatest mysteries is how it began. Scientists have pinned it down to roughly this. Some chemical reactions occurred about 4 billion years ago, perhaps in a primordial tidal soup, or maybe with help of volcanoes, or possibly at the bottom of the sea or between the mica sheets to create biology. So basically what it's saying is 4 billion years ago, life just started in some random primordial soup or with some volcanoes and some chemicals splashed together, and it created life. That's what it's saying. As of the time of this writing, which is post 2009, no, scientists have never created cellular life in a laboratory from scratch. And this is my favorite part. The technology simply does not yet exist to manipulate molecules with the precision required to create all the inner workings of a cell built one atom at a time. Now, how much sense does that make? You're telling me that 4.5 billion years ago, that some random chemicals came together to create life, yet us, with our most current technology and our understanding of biology and physics and anatomy and all these different things, cannot even come close to replicating it. It says, however, many of the important building blocks of life have indeed been created in the laboratory, including amino acids, self-replicating RNA molecules, and self-sealing and self-replicating lipid bubbles, which are profound steps toward the goal of one day creating fully synthetic life. Okay, so they're saying we couldn't create life, but we got really close. We created some amino acids and a few other things, and it's profound steps. Let me explain to you how far they actually got. So amino acids are like building blocks of a cell. It's like letters, right? Letters create words, sentences, sentences create paragraphs, paragraphs create chapters and books and so on. That's the building block to make a protein. A single protein, and the smallest proteins need at least 70 to 100 amino acids. Okay. In order to create a cell, you need 42 million protein molecules, which in turn means you need 2.9 billion amino acids to make a single cell. And what they just said is that we created a couple of amino acids. That would be like me saying, if let's say I have a box of toothpicks and I drop them, I could probably form a couple of letters, right? If they just randomly fell on the floor, I could probably form a P or a T or an H or an I or J or something like that. What they're saying is basically like me dropping toothpicks and me coming up with a Shakespeare play. And then not only that, but I have to fill up the entire Grand Canyon with books of toothpick dropping Shakespeare plays. It's just so astronomically impossible for them to have gotten close. And I believe what they're doing is sort of letting us know, for those who don't understand how biology works, I think they're trying to confuse people. I think they're trying to say we got close, but in reality, they really didn't. The other thing about proteins is that it depends on DNA for their formation, and DNA cannot form without a pre-existing protein. So what it's saying is all of this stuff had to come together at the exact same time. You cannot have one without the other. Now, when I was in school, I often heard the phrase simple cell. Now let's talk about how simple is this simple cell. I have a quote here. It says, in Darwin's day, the cell was thought to be just a simple sac filled with jellied carbon. This concept is the origin of the term protoplasm. However, nearly after 150 years of cell research has shown us that even a protozoan and fungi cells are hugely complex. Today we know that even the simplest cells, eukaryotes, have an estimated 100. Down here it says the cell cannot live until all these parts are working properly. So again, you have 100,000 parts working properly at the exact same time during their formation. I don't even know what the odds of that happening is, but I would call that downright impossible. And it says if we were able to magnify the DNA of the E. coli to the thickness of a clothesline, it would be 5 miles long. Now, a single cell, when we think about the complexity of it, because we see cells all day, but we don't really observe them under microscopes. A single cell is more complex than New York City at rush hour. Okay, so I don't know who here has been to New York City, but if you think about all the businesses that are running, all of the floors, all of the subway systems, and people walking up and down stairs and talking on the phone and crossing the street and selling pizza and selling hot dogs and Times Square and the photo shoots and all of the stuff happening, one cell of life is more complex than that city, New York, at rush hour. So, and the reason I bring that up is because just because something is smaller doesn't make it simpler. This is a picture of an ant in the year 1999 holding a microchip that can process every letter in the Bible 200 times a second. We think just because it's a small cell, it's simple. That's not the case. What about when you compare a honeybee to a supercomputer, right? Energy consumption: honeybee 10 microwatts, a supercomputer many kilowatts. Bees, they're pretty cheap. They don't cost a whole lot. $48 million for a supercomputer. Maintenance personnel: these bees are self-healing, right? Just they have immune systems just like we do. Whereas these supercomputers, they have to have all these technicians and they have to check in, they have to keep it at a certain temperature, blah blah blah. And we're saying that a bee evolved in a computer is designed. Think about that. We have something that's so simple, something that's so small like a honeybee. It's infinitely more complex than this computer, and we think of it as the opposite. We think that no one designed something like a honeybee. And then when you talk about the human brain, it's millions of times more complex than a honeybee. What about the eye, right? Something as simple as a single eye. It would take a minimum of 100 years of Cray computer time to simulate what takes place in your eye many times every second. Now, granted, this was written in 1985. We live in 2021. Things are different now. But the thought that an eye, that according to the evolutionists, has evolved for millions of years and is simple, and yet this supercomputer that took who knows how many scientists to build 100 years of computer time to simulate the same thing is ridiculous. What about the trilobite? They have compound lenses, about 280 of them, allowing them vision in all directions day and night. They are the most sophisticated eye lenses ever produced by nature. Human eyes only have one lens. They have 280. Just because these things are smaller and appear to be simpler does not mean that's the case. They're highly, highly sophisticated and highly, highly designed. What about an owl, right? Owls, their eyes are so well developed that they are not even eyeballs. They're actually more like tubes. So this creates an advantage for the owl in the sense that it gives him a better sense of where to look, but he can't turn his eyes the way that a human does. So that means when an owl is looking at you, it means he's looking at you. You can't turn the eye, but it gives him so many more advantages that surpass the sight of even a human. And then the other question about this that I have is, okay, if this eye evolved, how was the owl able to see between the time the eyeball was partway round and partway cylinder? How does that even work? How do you process that? Now let's go into macroevolution. We talked about it a little bit before, but it's basically evolution on above the species level, right? So you could say like a single-celled amoeba turns into a jellyfish, turns into a trilobite, to a fish, to a reptile, to a beaver, to a human or an ape, right? That's basically what it's saying. Now, I got this quote from Berkeley Institute, right? The big college in Northern California came from here. And this is what they said on their website. It is not necessarily easy to see macroevolutionary history. There are no first-hand accounts to be read. Now think about this. No first-hand accounts to be read. Does that mean that it's scientific? If science is about being able to test, being able to research, being able to study, Technically, that's not even scientific. There's no firsthand accounts and we can't see it. That's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous. I don't care what school this comes from. Microevolution, this is again from Berkeley, and they said microevolution is within a single population. It is a group of organisms that interbreed with each other. That is, they all share a gene pool. Biologists who study evolution at this level define evolution as a change in gene frequency within a population. So you could convince me that a wolf, a fox, a coyote, and dog all have a similar or the same ancestor. You could convince me that a zebra, a horse, a donkey all have the same ancestor. That's basically what it's saying. And ironically, this is the only one that has actually been seen in nature. This is the only type of evolution that we've actually proven exists. And what I find so amusing is if we go to the book of Genesis chapter 1, it says the exact same thing. And I read it here. It says, "And God created great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind." Kind is another way of saying species in this context. "Every winged fowl after his kind, and God saw that it was good." And then it says, "Be fruitful and multiply." And that's key too, because if you're talking about macroevolution, we have never seen a dog produce a non-dog, right? We've only seen them produce something similar to their kind. We've never seen a human produce a non-human. Now that human may have birth defects, they may be missing a limb, they could even be twins conjoined at the head, but it's still a human. We've never seen a human produce an eagle or a reptile. That doesn't happen, and it's never been observed. And for people to say that these fossils from thousands of years ago did this doesn't make any sense either, because why would something in the dirt from millions or thousands or millions of years ago be able to do something that we cannot do today? If it was simpler back then, we should be able to see and reproduce that in our modern day. This is from Conflicts Between Darwin and Paleontology. It says, "The situation hasn't changed much. Ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time." Now, I'm sure some of you have heard about Charles Darwin, a very famous individual. He basically he basically popularized the theory of evolution, even though he didn't create it. Now, we're going to get into him a little bit, but what about the dating method, right? We see all these fossils and they're clearly millions of years old. And we know that because scientists did all their tests and they have these fancy laboratories and their cool lab coats and they walk around with their clipboards and are scientists. So we have to believe them. Let's see. I have a quote here. "Living mollusk shells were carbon dated as being 2,300 years old." I cannot make this up. How do you have a living mollusk shell dated to be over 2,000 years old? The amount of C14 or carbon-14 produced in the atmosphere varies with the sun's solar activity and fluctuations in Earth's magnetic field. This means that the radiocarbon clock can race ahead or seemingly stop for up to 5 centuries. So it's saying that the dating isn't even accurate. As a result, raw radiocarbon dates sometimes diverge from real calendar years by hundreds or even thousands of years. If I walk up to you and I tell you that I am either 26 years old or 4,026 years old, that would make no sense, right? That's basically what they're saying. They're saying that their system has seriously high discrepancies, and people know about it. It's not hidden. This was written years ago. And this is my favorite quote. "If a carbon-14 or C14 date supports our theories, we put it in the main text. If it does not entirely contradict them, we put it in a footnote. And if it is completely out of date, we just drop it." What that tells me is that these people have an agenda. If it supports them, we'll put it in. If it doesn't, we'll throw it out completely, or we'll throw away evidence that does not support our theory. Does that sound scientific to you based on the definition? Improve a theory or a hypothesis. That's not even science anymore. That's called an agenda. Now let's talk about the geologic time column. So for those who do not know, geologic column is basically a series of rock layers, and they say the lower the rock layer is, the the oh, they say that the lower the rock layer is, the older it is, right? So if you find something at the very bottom, then it's so many millions of years older than the one above it, and so on and so forth. And each one has a different name. Each increment of time in the stratigraphy could be characterized by a particular assemblage of fossil organisms, formerly termed biostratigraphic zone by the German paleontologist Friedrich, that name. The data are determined by the rocks, not by preconceived notions about what will be found. So let's read that again. Of fossil organisms. So they're saying we date by the fossils, and in the same statement, it says the data are determined by the rocks. So we know how old the rocks are based on the fossils. We know how old the fossils are because of the rocks we find them in. That is circular reasoning. And this is what's being promoted in all these schools, all these scientists. This is what they believe. And it doesn't even take a scientist or even an adult to see that. A child could see that that's circular reasoning. What about the so-called missing links that they've been talking about? Now, I'm an artist. I know for a fact that I can make something appear to look however I want it to. Now, this is from Time Magazine, How Man Began, June 1999. I would say about 70% of this skull is actually missing, and the rest of it they found. Why is it, if they're teaching all of this stuff and they say we've been around for millions of years, why is it that we can't find a full skeleton of any of these creatures? Why is that? If there's millions of them, if it's been happening since time began, no one's been able to answer that question. There have been stories where archaeologists will go and find bones in the dirt, and they get threatened to lose their funding, and they end up finding all these random bones that are sometimes even 500 feet to a mile apart of each other. If someone dies, how far is their arm going to be from their leg? Probably going to be in the same spot, right? So why are they finding them miles away from each other? Why have coelacanths remained virtually unchanged for eons, 30 million generations? It's a long time for a group of creatures to not change at all, unless the time scale is messed up, unless they're dating them incorrectly. Darwin's agenda. So let's talk about him a little bit more. We must, however, acknowledge, as it seems to me, that man with all his noble qualities still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his, quote, lowly origin. What does that mean, Charlie? Let's see. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. Okay, so what's so strange about that? You know, man from the 1800s clearly has a bit of a issue with racism, and that, to be fair, was very common. But here's the problem. What does that lead to in the minds of society? If you're separating lowly races of people, or people with lowly origins, or savage races, then that means there must be someone who's higher up. You see how that fits? Do you see how that kind of fits in with the modern construction of racism that we have today? And for those who don't believe me, we haven't even gotten into it yet. The Origin of Species. You guys have probably heard about this book. That's the most famous book by Charles Darwin. Back in the day, they had really long titles for books in the 1800s. And so what you may not know is that's not the entire title. Let's look at what it actually is. It's called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. What is a favored race in this context? What do you guys think? Charles Darwin says, when we descend to details, we cannot prove that a single species has changed, nor can we prove that the supposed changes are beneficial, which is the groundwork of the theory. So now he's written this whole book and come up with this theory, and he says we can't even prove it. And then we can't prove that these changes that we're seeing are beneficial. When he went on the Galapagos Islands and studied I forget what type of bird it was, but he studied these birds, and they saw that the beaks were different based on the time of year and genetics. And yeah, it makes sense that there will be adaptations. in a single species. But then to jump from there and promote macroevolution is absolutely ridiculous. And to prove that, and to emphasize the fact that he didn't know, he then points to the future generations and future scientists and says, I look with confidence to the future, to young and rising naturalists. And then going down, he says, the future geologists discovering in a fossil state numerous intermediate gradations. So he's like, I can't prove it, but I'm pretty sure in a couple of hundred years, you guys will be able to, because you'll have more access to stuff. Oh, thank you. Appreciate it. So one of the things that he also mentioned was that these changes are, he wasn't sure that the changes were beneficial, right? That's part of the whole thing about evolution, is that things get better with time. So let's talk about something called the second law of thermodynamics, or the law of entropy. And basically what it means is things degenerate into a more disordered state over time, right? You have a banana, you leave it on the counter, over a couple of days, it goes to really brown. There was a time where this car was brand new and the hottest thing on the street, and I'm sure someone was waxing the car and getting ready to go on a date and all that stuff, and now it's a hunk of junk. And then you just look at the natural aging process. Someone who's 23 years old looks very different at 101 years old. There is not a single product or object on this planet that increases in value with time and use. So the fact that you're trying to say these theories, so this fact that you're trying to say that these theories and these things get better with time is just going against laws that we already know. Many of you may not even know this, but according to this article, there have been human-sized penguin fossils discovered in New Zealand. Human-sized, 5 to 6 feet tall penguins found in New Zealand. What about dragonflies? The largest insect ever existed was a giant dragonfly, and it says here that it had a wingspan that was 2 feet long. That's like the size of an average car windshield. Can you imagine that thing just flying at you? How scary that would be. You probably have little kids trying to, run away from it. And, those things will run off with your children, right? And then we also have beavers, who have also been seen to be 5 feet tall. We have the fossils. Now, would you say that the modern penguin, the modern dragonfly, and the modern beaver have all increased in terms of their efficiency and value, or has it decreased? Have they gotten smaller and weaker over time? The fossil record clearly tells us. We just see it. It doesn't take a rocket scientist or a brain surgeon to figure this out. Now, the other reason why I think that evolution is dangerous when it's connected with racism is it inspired someone like Adolf Hitler, and says Hitler's mind was captivated by evolutionary thinking, probably since the time he was a boy. Evolutionary ideas lie at the basis of all that is worst in Mein Kampf and his public speeches. So he believes in evolution, and we saw how much he hated certain groups of people. No more than nature desires the mating of weaker with stronger individuals, even less does she desire the blending of a higher with a lower race, mingling of Aryan blood with that of lower peoples. The result was the end of the cultured people, according to Adolf Hitler in his book. Now, I don't know if you guys have ever wondered why Hitler hated the Jews so much, but he actually had a list of what he saw as less than. He thought the Nordic blonde hair, blue eye was close to pure Aryan, and then Germanic brown hair, blue eyed, or less desirable brown eye was predominantly Aryan. And you go down, Mediterranean, Slavic, Oriental, Black African, and the Jews he thought was close to pure ape. That's what inspired his thinking, and not only his thinking, but the kids Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, who were the perpetrators of the Columbine shooting. They believed in Hitler's message so much that they ended up committing the crime on his birthday. April 20th is the day Hitler was born. And if I'm not mistaken, one of them was wearing a shirt that said natural selection, which is basically the slogan of Darwinian evolution. The mental life of savages rises little above that of the higher mammals, especially the apes, with which they are genealogically connected. These lower races, such as the Vedas or Australian Negroes, are psychologically nearer to the mammals, apes or dogs, than to civilized Europeans. We must therefore assign a totally different value to their lives. And that's Ernst Haeckel. That's the same one who messed up those drawings a little while ago. The standard of intelligence of the average adult Negro is similar to that of the 11-year-old youth of the species Homo sapiens. So not only are they saying the average adult is not as bright as an 11-year-old child, but they don't even consider they didn't even consider the adult black person the same species. And this is in 1980 that this was written. No rational man cognizant, I'm sorry, this is 1926 when that was written. No rational man cognizant of the facts believes that the average Negro is the equal of the white man. And if this be true, it is simply incredible that when all his disabilities are removed, he will be able to compete successfully with his bigger brained and smaller jawed rival in a contest which is to be carried out by thoughts and not by bites. You see where this thinking leads? By thinking that, by believing in evolution, we basically surrender ourselves to the idea that someone has evolved higher than the next. And if you believe that, then you might say, well, the darker skinned people look closer to ape. And so therefore we are higher up and therefore I'm better. There's one exhibit in South Wales where a missionary was horrified to see he witnessed a slaughtering of 40 of Aboriginal men, women, and children. 45 of those heads were then boiled down, and then the 10 best skulls were packed overseas and sent to a museum for proof of evolution. Community of people to prove evolution and to put it in a museum. I have plenty of other quotes here. Theodore Roosevelt, I wish very much that the wrong people could be prevented entirely from breeding. And it's just awful. And I want to share just a couple last quotes. These are the last two slides I have about some of the real reasoning behind it, because it's not just about science per se. The reason I brought up faith is because there is an element of this that I believe is very, very prominent. So let's see. For a fruitful debate, we need to understand evolution's foundation. We need to understand this because ultimately evolution is not about scientific details. Ultimately, evolution is about God, according to Cornelius Hunter and Darwin's God. The absolutely overwhelming evidence points toward an intelligence behind life's creation, Walter Bradley. The universe is unlikely, very unlikely, deeply shockingly unlikely. The fact that we're even existing on planet Earth as opposed to Mars or Venus or anywhere else in the universe, we live in the perfect place for life to thrive. If we were even just 1 degree off, even in the speed of the Earth's rotation, we would be dead. Let's see. I'm going to skip to this bottom quote. Spontaneous generation was disproved 100 years ago, but that leads us to only one other conclusion, that is supernatural creation. We cannot accept that on philosophical grounds. Therefore, we choose to believe the impossible, that life arose spontaneously by chance. I promise this is the last slide. Lee Strobel, as an atheist, he wrote the book The Case for a Creator, and it says, I didn't want there to be a God who would hold me responsible for my immoral lifestyle. Friedrich Nietzsche said, why should God rule and I serve? When talking about God, Thomas Nagel says, I don't want the universe to be like that. And then the final quote, number 5, the materialistic views of Darwin, Huxley, Simpson, Monod, and Dawkins are based on personal philosophy, not empirical evidence. This is not science, but myth. So why is evolution and creation so important? It's because it ultimately isn't about science. It's about the character of God. It's about where you believe you come from, the dignity of mankind and of all creatures and the entire planet. This is an incredibly dangerous theory. And the fact that it's being propagated and presented to young children and raising them in a way where they don't understand these things, that most people don't even question this stuff. So I hope that for you all, it gave you something to think about when considering this topic. And I hope that if there's any questions that you'll be able to find the answers to them very, very soon. Thank you.